It's been a little while since our last case here on the Flophouse Files, and while we've already combed through some fighting game fables before, specifically about perennial suspect Sega, we're cracking open our books once again. Now, when people usually think of this Japanese publisher in fighting games, their minds immediately jump to the sharp polygons and moon jumps of Virtua Fighter, its flagship fighting franchise. It was Sega's Street Fighter II for all intents and purposes, and for the majority of the 90s and the early 2000s, it was their arcade crown jewel. Now, while the eternal champions were sacrificed for the mighty and highfalutin Virtua Fighters in the Great War between Sega US and Sega Japan, VF wound up suffering its own drawn-out death march of non-existence. Hell, come to think of it, Sega's entire fighting game lineup shriveled like a rotten grape in the hot sun. Why, you ask? Well, with help from frequent contributor Morales, let's get to the bottom of the case of the Forgotten Phantom Fighters. It all started when this polygonal powerhouse released in 1993, which is a lie. Well, yeah, I mean Virtua Fighter did release in '93, but the first chapter of Sega's fighting game history didn't start with it. In fact, there were two others which predated it. When Street Fighter II pile droved the arcade scene in 1991, Sega was quick to try to ape its success, but didn't exactly achieve that end goal.
It's always great to see guys in good shape.
Colosseum was a bizarre, early attempt to replicate a traditional one-on-one martial arts experience, but without all the clutter of backgrounds or compelling characters or anything really. It felt more like a simulator in the strictest sense. It leaned more towards simplistic mechanics and lacked much flash, but to its credit, had some very swanky animation. It hit arcades in December of 1992, and if you've never heard of it, well, there's a reason. It wasn't much of a monetary success and never saw a single home port. Then, just 1 month later, in January of 1993, Sega released a vastly different option to hopefully capture the imaginations and quarters of fight game fans. This was Dark Edge, a futuristic 2D, 3D hybrid that, even in 2021, is quite the thing to look at. Check out those gams! Now, while composed entirely of sprites, which the game would rotate and scale the bejesus out of on the fly, it allowed characters to circle and maneuver around each other in a fake three-dimensional way. Despite looking this impressive, it was hard though to judge the distance between you and your foe, and was probably responsible for younger fans chucking their lunches on the floors of their local arcade. And much like Colosseum, it also failed to light up Sega's coin-op profits. Now, while those two games were being crafted by separate teams, Sega still had yet another iron in the fire in their stubborn bid for fighting supremacy. Yu Suzuki, who was behind a string of massive hits for the company, was the logical and perhaps last choice that they were going to take on this newfangled fighting game fad. Fortunately, Yu Suzuki and his team wound up making history with Virtua Fighter, the first 3D fighting game ever and a watershed moment for polygonal-based development in general. A lot of decisions on VF were made to keep the game's gameplay as simple to understand as possible with one punch, one kick, and one block. With that said, within that 3-button setup were dozens of varied moves, throws, and combinations per character, leading to a very robust fighting system. AM2, the team which Suzuki headed up, also favored lightning-fast action, with a mere 30 seconds per round to duke it out, and with almost every move dealing out incredibly high damage. Marry that with impactful sound effects, iconic quotes, "I win!" and finally a sublime soundtrack, and it should be no surprise that it was an instant hit all over the globe. Yeah, the backgrounds were very simplistic, but it was to help you focus on the action, because these Virtua Fighters didn't pick the ballroom, they just danced. While the game was meant to invoke 90s virtual reality with its blocky LEGO warriors,
he got me from behind. Oh my god.
It also helped the team hone in with simple but distinct personalities and archetypes for every member of the roster. Virtua Fighter exploded in popularity, spawning special re-releases, ports, spin-offs, and even cameos in other Sega games. So it didn't take long for headhunters at Namco, Sega's old arcade rival, to come sniffing around for talent to poach. Several staffers who worked on the first Virtua Fighter were then lured away from AM2 and would wound up molding Tekken into the 1v1 fighting game it is today, which is something that would have ramifications down the line. A Virtua Fighter sequel was then put into immediate production, this time running off the improved Model 2 engine. Released in late '94 in Japan and January '95 elsewhere, Virtua Fighter 2 saw improved textures, more polygons, better lighting, and added 2 new fighters. Older Man, and Young Boy. While it played fundamentally the same, its improvements in visuals and presentation put it heads and shoulders above Tekken 1, which released at almost the exact same time. Sega knew they now had the bedrock to build upon, and much like Street Fighter II, they decided to pump out more games with the same template. The most famous of these was Fighting Vipers, which took VF's basic gameplay setup but added a few important flourishes. The characters took on a more wild look, liberally lifting from whatever's popular in the 90s. Extreme sports, music, anime, all that jazz. Walled-off cages constructed around the rings were introduced, which would lead to an added selection of moves, and finally, if you landed enough hits to an opponent's lower or upper half, their armor would break off in spectacular fashion, leaving them in a weakened state, and, of course, with less clothing. Check out those games! Since the control layout of these games proved to be popular and the Model 2 engine easy to program, Sega then thought it would work with franchises outside of the fighting game space. Hence, Sonic the Fighters. Now, while not nearly the success it probably seemed like it was going to be on paper, having Sonic and his super popular chums duking it out in 3D brawls didn't exactly translate all that well, and the reception was mixed to say the least. Still though, it was worth a shot. I mean, look at this, it's just so stupid that it's amazing. But that's not all though. Sega's fighting game boom even caught the eye of other companies who found themselves on the ropes in the mid-90s, with one such company being Tecmo. On the brink of bankruptcy, they desperately needed a hit, and so they licensed the Model 2 engine from Sega to produce the first Dead or Alive, which is why both games shared a lot in common in terms of their mechanics, although, obviously, they added some accoutrements. So, 1996 was really a banger year for AM2, as they probably hit their peak, evidenced of course by the wild and wacky Fighters Megamix. This was a love letter to all of AM2's arcade output, and not just of the pugilistic variety. I mean, yeah, that was the main draw, but that didn't mean other characters from Sonic, Virtua Cop, and Daytona couldn't join the fray. While it was certainly a gas, it was not meant to be a serious competitive fighter, but more of a goofy mashup to appeal to casual fans. That unfortunately meant it didn't exactly translate directly to record profits, and that might be because of a bit of oversaturation on Sega's part. The original Vipers was released in US arcades at the top of '96, followed by Sonic, which was then followed up again by Megamix, and yet another completely separate game after that. This time, developed by AM3, who had just finished Virtua On. Wait, no? It's Virtual? This isn't part of the Virtua-verse? Weird. Anyway, AM3 were also the team who made Dark Edge, funnily enough. This new game, however, was Last Bronx, and it set itself apart with its usage of weapons, as well as its characters, which borrowed heavily from Japanese street fashion. While certainly a competent game, it saw even less success than Vipers and didn't even get close to sniffing a sequel. Oh, and remember when I said that this was the last fighter Sega put out in 1996? Yep, I lied again. There was one more, and it wound up being pretty important in the grand scheme of things. Virtua Fighter 3, running on the new Model 3, was, at the time, the most graphically advanced video game in the world. Just for comparison's sake, let's stack it up against another famous 3D innovator, also released in 1996, and yeah, that's pretty much night and day. Unfortunately, for as good as it looked, VF3 started to vary things up to a mostly tepid response. It introduced uneven terrain in its stages, which could give tactical advantages as you navigated them via the new button, Dodge, as well as 2 new fighters. Despite these changes though, there was a certain apathy towards VF3, and when you got deeper into the mechanics, it wasn't a gigantic leap forward. This is also the point where Tekken started to overtake Virtua Fighter, especially outside Japan, and especially even more on the PlayStation, which had trounced the Sega Saturn in sales since, well, the very beginning. This greatly bit into the console popularity cherry pie for Sega's franchise, which was further exemplified in 1997 when the home port of Tekken 3 managed to sell 8.5 million copies, which, by a very narrow margin, was just shy of how many Sega Saturn consoles were ever even sold. Virtua Fighter 3 TB, which stood for Team Battle, was seen by some as a underwhelming port, featuring added bugs and very little new or exclusive content, and really, it paled in comparison when stacked up against Namco's own mighty
Soul Calibur.
Now, let's be honest with ourselves, Soul Calibur was the fighter to get in 1999, and was a more polished, value-filled package that actually did make the Dreamcast's launch, boosting its visibility. So, it was swords and souls that became synonymous with the Dreamcast, and not Virtua Fighter. Therefore, if the flagship series was struggling, then its sister games certainly were as well. The Fighting Vipers sequel, appropriately titled Fighting Vipers 2, saw a Dreamcast port in Japan and Europe, and that's it, which really said it all. And after that, it was all pretty much downhill. Sega's withdrawal from the hardware business after the Dreamcast's commercial failure meant they had to tighten the old belt, and that meant that their arcade business would need to be scaled back. So no more Vipers, Hedgehogs, or last Bronxes. But Virtua Fighter remained, as it was still very much a force in Japan. It wasn't all doom and gloom though, as the franchise could now branch out on far more popular machines like the mighty PS2. Hell, Sony's Juggernaut even played host to an obscure Sega Ages port of Last Bronx of all things, and it didn't sell very well. Virtua Fighter 4, however, running on the Sega Naomi board in arcades, flourished on the PlayStation 2, where it wound up being the most successful home port of the entire franchise, selling over 1.5 million copies. It was so successful that this fourth entry saw several distinct releases and revisions, including Evolution, 10th Anniversary Edition, and Final Tuned. However, the deeper the 2000s wore on, the further fighting game profits would plunge, as arcade earnings dwindled in many western parts of the world. And there was yet another problem. Yu Suzuki's costly development of Shenmue and its subsequent failure to recoup said costs decreased his standing within Sega, and after Virtua Fighter 4, he took on a much more hands-off approach to game development. Thus, Virtua Fighter 5 was developed without his direct involvement, and by the time it saw a home port in 2007, the financial viability of fighting games were at an all-time low. New entries in Tekken saw a fraction of the sales that its third entry had enjoyed, so things were down across the board. Similarly, VF5's timed PS3 exclusive debut started not with a roar, but a whimper, with much of that having to do with the PS3's own hamstrung performance for the first few years of its life. Also, lacking any form of online play in 2007 usually does a fighting game no favors. Now, while that would be rectified by the eventual Xbox 360 version released months later, the damage had already been done. Sega still hadn't completely thrown in the towel just yet, only mostly. Virtua Fighter 5's latest arcade revision, Final Showdown, came to both the PS3 and Xbox 360 in 2012, both with online, but both downgraded to a digital-only release. While this is considered one of the best entries in the entire series, and it hit its Japanese sales targets, it again did not perform up to the publisher's standards elsewhere in the world. So there it is, Sega's last official fighting game as of right now. Usually it takes a senior producer or director to spearhead the resurrection of an IP, but with Yu Suzuki having long departed the company, VF has remained dormant for the last 9 years, aside from Mobile Drek, of course. There have been some random bare-bones Model 2 arcade ports farted out onto the Xbox 360 and PS3 here and there, but that's pretty much it. Oh wait! How could I forget? There is one version of Virtua Fighter that Sega is more than happy to re-release over and over and over again. Fortunately, there is one last, potentially happy chapter left in this story. A Korean ratings board posted up a listing that says, in black and white, Virtua Fighter 5 Ultimate Showdown for the PS4. Furthermore, this image leaked on a PSN trophy list just a few weeks ago, so it's almost a sure thing that this is legit. Something is happening. Oh, sure, it's not a brand new sequel or even a collection of all the prior games with online, but it is something. If people want this legendary series to return in full force, though, they're going to need to support it with cold, hard digital cash. It's been almost a decade since the last Virtua release, and fighting games have been back for most of, if not all of that time. Tekken 7 is now the second most successful Iron Fist of all time, and MK11 was the 5th best-selling game in general of all of 2019. So the fighting game is hot once again. If there was ever a time for Akira, Pai, and Wolf to return to the ring, it's now. The fans are ready. Throughout this investigation, we've seen how simple misjudgments in timing, platforms, and oversaturation led to a fighting game dynasty falling apart in a few short years. So, time will tell if Sega has learned from their mistakes. Thanks to Morales once again for sliding this case file across my desk. And if you'd like to submit your own gaming industry mystery, curio, or phenomena, let me know in the comments below or head on over to the Flophouse VIP offices to nominate the case you want me to get to the bottom of next. Until then, I'll see you next time on the Flophouse Files.